So welcome to everyone. I'm Rebecca Snyder. I'm the Executive Director of the Maryland, Delaware, DC Press Association, and I am delighted to have you all here. And I'm especially excited for our topic today, which is reporting on Maryland's legislature. We have an unprecedented time. I feel like that's so overused, but it's true. Our first virtual session in Maryland and across the country is upon us. And with that, it creates some challenges and some opportunities in reporting. And so with me today, we have 4 State House reporters. And I'll introduce them in just a moment, but I did want to note that we are recording this session so you can access it later. There will be an opportunity for your questions as well. I think we're a small enough group that we can sort of jump in as needed, but also if you prefer to use the chat function, I'll be monitoring that or any technical issues that come up. So with all that being said, I wanted to introduce our panelists and get us started. So I'll just go around from my left to right as the Zoom boxes appear to me. So our first panelist is Ovetta Wiggins. Oh my gosh, let me try that again. Ovetta Wiggins from the Washington Post, who has been a veteran State House reporter for many years. Then we also have Pamela Wood, State House Bureau Chief, I believe, not the Bureau Chief anymore, so State House reporter for the Baltimore Sun, Bryan Sears with the Daily Record, and Danielle Gaines of Maryland Matters. So welcome to all. And I wanted to start off just really by asking sort of your experiences of this session. As you know, it's been a crazy news cycle. There's just in general, but then specifically around Maryland, how is this session different than previous sessions?
Okay, I'll go first. I'll start.
Rebecca, it might help if you start off somebody with a question so we know which one of us is supposed to talk.
All right.
I'll start. One of the things that was, I felt so disconnected when I first walked into the chamber on opening day. I'm sure everybody else felt the same way. Ordinarily we're on the floor, very close to the lawmakers. This time around, because of COVID, we're up in the gallery, and just that disconnection from the action makes a major difference in our reporting, I feel. Some of the others might want to jump in about that.
Yeah, I think Ovetta makes a good point. I mean, there's a lot to be said about being able to sit on the floor of the House or the Senate and lawmakers walk by. They typically come up and chat with us. The ability to, after session, go out onto the floor and talk with lawmakers and right in the moment when something has happened. The ability to get walk and talks is a little more difficult because we can't sort of catch them on the floor, and you've got to watch the social distancing. But it's also sort of the other things which, like, for example, the House of Delegates here in Maryland is not meeting until February. So they're doing these pro forma sessions where, we have a gang of 3 legislators, the Speaker of the House, the Majority, and the Minority Leader, who come in a couple of days a week, really for about 2.5 minutes. I mean, and I've been timing it, 2.5 minutes to introduce bills and send them to committee, which is something we've not seen before. So even some of the administrative functions of how the House and the Senate operate are completely different.
Another thing, oh God, Danielle.
Well, I was just going to say another way that kind of like disconnection manifested for me, it didn't have to do with legislating at all, but the memorial ceremony for Mike Miller was just so dramatically different from the memorial ceremony for Mike Bush. Obviously, they both were like somber occasions, but there was hugging and crying and cheering and laughing and all this stuff, and like a real sense of togetherness during the session they had after Mike Bush died. And that was all kind of missing in this session they had last week. It was very strange. It just put like a very strange feeling over the whole affair.
Yeah, I'd add the disconnect of not having the personal touches, not just in the chambers where they have the full sessions of the House and the Senate, but also the committees as well. Now they've always, or for many years, they've been online. You could view them, but most of us would be there in person and as often as we could. And one thing that was always valuable is the lawmakers would see you there, right? And then they would come over and say, oh, you should know this about this bill. Or that was also a place where you could, pigeonhole lawmakers as getting them to or from committee, but then they would know that you're monitoring this issue. And now we're all at home watching committee hearings online. They have no idea who's watching them, who's there. And yeah, again, you can't see it in person. And I think this is the same for everybody else is at the State House. Since we can't get lawmakers in person hardly ever, we're burning up their phones with like texts and phone calls. And it's just hard to get them at the right moment where they'll answer their phone. It's definitely more challenging.
And I wanted to add to not just on the floor, but for me, reporting, I tend to take sources out to lunch or get a cup of coffee, that kind of thing. That's impossible now, which sort of impacts reporting. So
yeah,
and
along
also seeing reactions. You only see the reaction of whoever's on camera, and you can't like get the full sense of what's going down.
Yeah, and similar to what Ovetta mentioned about, going out for coffee or running into somebody, having a drink or whatever. We also, a lot of times, those of us who work on the ground floor of the State House, lawmakers and lobbyists too, and advocates like walk by and they pop their heads in and they drop up their press releases and they try and convince us to write about their bills. And that's not happening either. Nobody's in there. The very few lawmakers who are there, but usually just being present helps. Last year I started sometimes just in the afternoons, if I wasn't covering a committee hearing, I would take my laptop and just sit in the hallway of the House office building and just seeing people going to and fro. And man, I got so many good tips that way. Just being present doesn't help anymore.
So what do you think is, there's a lot of interconnectedness in terms of sort of the little bits of information you're picking up or not hearing. Do you think that there are issues that are kind of getting swept aside? What do you kind of, I know you don't know what you don't know at this point, but what do you think you're missing that or legislators are missing? Because journalists can't get in there, but the public can't get in there either. So what do you think is not being heard?
I think sometimes you miss the who's talking to who, the side conversations that happen, the occasional lawmaker that wanders out into the hallway to talk to an advocate, running into people in the hallway and picking up pieces of intel that you didn't necessarily have about, a bill that might have had a hearing the day before, but suddenly has got some momentum and looks like it's moving fast. So I think a lot of times you miss sort of the stuff that's happening under the surface because we can't be there sort of talking to people and seeing things happening in real time.
Right, because a lot of what happens.
Oh, I'm sorry. No, I was just going to say, I think a lot of those conversations now that Bryan referred to are happening on the telephone. One lawmaker's talking to another lawmaker, whereas we would see them interacting possibly on the floor, heading off to go talk to each other in the Senate lounge, or you see a lobbyist talking to a lawmaker in the hallway. Those things we're not seeing now. So a lot of those things are being done in private that otherwise would be done in public.
Mm-hmm. Right, because what happens, the public bill hearings that the committees have, a lot of that's really performance. That's not actually where the decisions are being made and where negotiations are happening. That's like a show for the public. And of course we cover that, but like that's not the only place where stuff happens, and we're unable to see that stuff happening because of, the restrictions.
Now, do you think like that's cutting some legislators out as well? Like I can almost see a point where legislators are like, oh, the small group, like that 3 that are setting the agenda and moving on. Like, is that concentrating power in the hands of a few to your perspective? And I know it's still early in the session and things are changing.
Well, I want to be clear about one thing. The gang of 3 that I mentioned. I mean, it's really administrative function, and so I don't want to give anybody the impression that there's sort of this accumulation of power to 3 members. They really come in and are doing an administrative function that the legislature would do every day. They would bring in 141 members of the House of Delegates, and part of their agenda every morning is to introduce the 10 or 15 or 50 bills that come in the morning and read them across the desk and get them assigned to committee. In a pandemic, you don't need 141 people in a room together to do that. They've pared it down to 3, a representation from both parties, and they're just moving the bills into committee. So there's no concentration of power, to my mind, with something like that. But look, I think whenever you have a situation where lawmakers are not together, they are not, there is always going to be somebody in a committee who is on the outside, a group of lawmakers who are on a group chat or a group text message chain, who are texting back and forth about bills that are exclusionary of other lawmakers. And one of the things that I think you have to be concerned about is at what point does that become an open meetings issue if you have enough lawmakers on a committee that are on a text message chain. That's a meeting by law. And so, but again, we as reporters, like, I would write about that if I knew it. How do I know about it? Because there's no motivation for lawmakers to say, hey, 9 or 10 of these lawmakers from the Ways and Means Committee are texting back and forth about a bill, and that's a quorum. And so I think there's always the possibility that some lawmakers are going to get cut out.
Yeah, and also just to that point about text messages, and is that a meeting, open meetings violation, or is that a document that's recoverable? And lawmakers have been told that their Zoom chat logs are public records. So to be thoughtful about what you put in the chat, because any one of us could do a PIA request and get their Zoom chat logs. So just.
Has anyone jumped in to try and do a PIA on the Zoom chat yet? Sounds like an exciting next frontier.
Danielle, I think in large part, if they've been warned they might be public, we probably won't see much action there.
Just the ones from the very beginning.
They'll be all like, oh, I can't get my computer to work.
I would actually argue, Rebecca, it probably behooves you to wait until mid-session, when they've gotten a little more relaxed about the rules and they're not thinking about the memo they got last week, and they start to loosen up a little bit, as people tend to do. I mean, and that probably is when the PIAs start showing some interesting things.
Good reporter pro tip. So we talked a lot about like access. Could you talk a little bit about the mechanics? I see just from your background, some of you are at home, some of you are in your state house offices. Are you able to be in the press pit? What does access look like? And then some of the mechanics earlier, Pam, you were talking about accessing written testimony. Can you talk to us about, like, how do you get the stuff that you need to report? And Pam, actually, why don't you, it looks like you're about to say something.
Oh, okay. Well, yeah, I mean, the Baltimore Sun is fortunate that we have our own office. It has no windows, it has terrible ventilation. It's not a good place to have multiple people. So I have a work partner, Bryn Stoll, and we are trying to, as much as we can, alternate who is there in person, who's at home. Like, I'm at home. So like last week I was at the State House a bunch. This week he's going to be the one who's present there more often for like the governor's press conferences and such. And I think probably everybody else is kind of weighing that risk of being in person when they decide whether to be home or at the State House.
We've taken the same approach. The Washington Post has its own office, and I work alongside Aaron Cox, and we alternate on who's in the State House covering the governor's press conferences or even for the legislative sessions. There's really no need at this point so early in the session for both of us to be there. And as we move, into February and March, when there's more action being taken on the floor, we'll make a decision on who's there and who's not.
I work down the hall in a room that houses probably about a dozen other reporters. I'm down the hall from Ovetta and from Pam. We do have windows. The ventilation is still just as bad. We did get an air purifier. The General Assembly put one in that room. Still, we have broken up. We've broken up the press corps a little bit. So Danielle and I sit actually pretty close to each other in the press room. She's now over in the Miller Senate building in an auxiliary press room. I think we've got about half the press in one room, half in the other. In the pit where I work, we're facing people out about every other desk or so. I tend to go, for me personally, I've made the decision, rather than being there every day, all day, I am there anytime one of the chambers is in session. Even if it's a pro forma, if they're just pro forma sessions, I'm there long enough for pro forma session and then I leave. I'm also there for anytime there's a press conference from the governor's office, and then sort of whatever other needs arise. The only other thing that's really changed for me is that because of the amount of time that I'm spending there and some things that are going on at home, I've managed to go 10 months of the pandemic without having to test. And I'm now testing twice a week, just as a precaution to make sure that I'm not bringing home anything to my wife.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And so I also wanted to understand, is the witness testimony and sort of access to the nuts and bolts source documents of the session, are those easily accessible to you all, or are you having trouble accessing information?
So go ahead, Danielle.
Well, so they aren't easy. I would say in past years, they haven't, written testimony. In the past years, written testimony hasn't been particularly easy to get in person either. So each committee has different policies. So like, shout out to House Ways and Means. Thank you very much. They always had a table with multiple copies of every piece of written testimony out there. It was very helpful to the public. It was very helpful to lobbyists and advocates and reporters. Other committees, it has, even in the before times, it was like pulling teeth to get testimony. And there were some committees where I just would automatically go to a member of the committee and say, hey, can you print me off your packet on X? Or like, can you slip me your folder on this bill? And I'll just take some pictures really quick. It always was a struggle to get written testimony. And then this year it's definitely been exacerbated. Even the committees that were really great before, it's not possible to get the access. They say that they have capability to do this because it's all internal. They have an internal filing system that's connected to the external view of bills that we see. And they say the written testimony will be available online, like to the broad public, I think when a bill comes back to the floor. Is that right? Or after second reader?
Yeah.
Something like that. But which is like way useful. Yeah, that's way late. And for those who haven't covered the General Assembly before, the written testimony is important because some people who testify in a bill do written only. They don't show up in person in the hearing. And especially this year where they're limiting a lot of the people who can testify, fewer people are in person. So they're going by written. And some people try and hide. Some advocates who have an unpopular position on a bill, you see this in like the judicial type bills. They don't want to be seen publicly opposing something, but they still want to get their points in front of lawmakers. And they know that lawmakers pick up those bill packets or the testimony packets when they vote. So it's important to be able to get that written testimony to see what people are really saying. And with the committees holding it back until bills get voted out, well, that's not very helpful, because having that insight means for better coverage and better public understanding before the committee votes.
And
I do want to say,
also, written testimony also, Pam is totally right. People try to hide in it, but then also sometimes it has like the more like technical points of how a bill should be amended, which is often where the stories lie.
And a really good example of that sort of plays off of what Danielle just said. There was a hearing last week with the state budget secretary who was opposing a bill that would change how the Board of Public Works is able to sort of cut the budget when the legislature is not in session. And David Brinkley, the budget secretary, specifically mentions that he's provided this sort of very detailed written testimony, which he's not going to read, that has all of these other details in it. And the details are not available online. And so could not get them from the administration. And what I ended up doing was reaching out to a lawmaker and basically just saying, hey, look, is there any way you could send this to me? I'd really like to read these. And was able to talk a lawmaker into providing me a copy of David Brinkley's comments, which really sort of helped fill in my story. But it would have been details that would have been completely lost to me and to other reporters because they're not available online. And I'll be real clear. I mean, I think we're all in agreement here, that at least the State House reporters, there is absolutely zero reason why these things cannot be posted online in real time. They are submitted electronically. They have to be submitted electronically. It's not even a button click. It is something they could automate. They like to pretend that that somehow the clock stopped when Washington resigned his commission, and God forbid we do anything that sort of changes the historical nature of whatever it is that they're doing. They're just really slow on the uptake in terms of technology, and this is one really good example.
Mm-hmm. So we have a question from Karen Denny, and thanks, Pam, for answering it, about voting sessions and how they're scheduled and the regularity of that. And it brings to mind, like, how transparent are voting sessions? It used to be that, you could just pop one in, you'd go in. And I recognize they probably haven't been voting a lot, but what's your impression of how that's been going?
This year they're online, which that's a major difference from past years. I mean, in the past, we sometimes wouldn't even know when they were voting on certain bills. So this year we'll actually, I can't even say that we'll know when they're voting on certain bills, but we'll know at least that they're voting, and that those voting sessions will be online.
And we can roll the tape.
Exactly.
Yeah, so this has been like in past sessions, like the bane of my existence, like come like March or so, is like running around trying to find when voting sessions are going to be and what the vote lists are, because they would never put them on the website. They would not always have the list. Sometimes you have to go to the office and like get a list, and then you show up and then they're not voting that vote list that day. It's like unnecessarily like total lack of transparency. So they are supposed to be posting when they're voting and the voting lists beforehand on the General Assembly website, and then videoing it, which this would be something we would do before, right? They would have bill hearings, and we would know it would be a bill hearing and then a voting session. So we would all sit in our offices, watch the bill hearing, and as soon as the camera went off, we would know we had to run down to go to the voting session, because the voting sessions weren't on video before, but now they are. So this is perhaps one like positive move towards transparency this year.
The best thing that could have ever happened as a result of the pandemic.
Yeah. And the other thing, like for in-person voting sessions too, like most of the committees had a habit of like, oh, we don't turn our microphones on for voting sessions because it's just us and we're just chatting. So even if you were in the room, like somebody could just strategically speak at a volume they chose to speak at, and being there didn't matter at all anyhow, which was beyond frustrating. So it is one small area where there's been increased transparency.
This, to me, this is another prime example of some of the lame-ass excuses that lawmakers come up with to not show you what's going on. The initial excuse for not doing this and not broadcasting them at all was because it would somehow tamp down the free exchange of ideas. And we all know from sitting in here that a lot of times, you know, this is where some of the work gets done, but it's also where both sides hone their arguments and their talking points on legislation. So a lot of times the things that you hear in these committees are things that you're going to hear 2 and 3 days later on the floor. The other issue is, you know, they would not, before pre-pandemic, they would not provide you with a list of bills that were being voted. And part of the lame excuse for that was, well, we can't do that because, you know, we might have a list, but not all these bills are actually going to get voted on. You know, like we may, as if they couldn't sort of give you a list that says exactly what we do now online, which is, here's a list of the 12 bills that might come up during the voting session, although not all of these may come up because we're only going to spend an hour voting today. Like they come up, they invent the reasons to not do something. To be perfectly honest with you, they've done a couple of these voting sessions and shown them online. We saw them last year towards the end of the pandemic. And as far as I can tell, Maryland isn't burning because of it. So, you know, to me, like, this is an argument to do this more and maybe even after the pandemic to continue the practice.
Yeah, and just for just by way of background, like, it wasn't so long ago, like maybe like 10, 15 years ago, they didn't even want people in the room during voting sessions, and especially reporters. And I covered a bill many years ago. I was like a baby reporter. It was about air pollution. And I sat in the room where they hashed out this bill, this really complicated amendments for days and days and days. They finally voted on it. I said something to the chairperson at the end of it, like, oh, you know, whatever. Oh God, this is all over with. And, you know, thanks for not like giving me a hard time. And he's like, well, I had to let you in the room. And to this day, lobbyists don't even sit in the rooms when they have voting sessions. But I just want to say, as someone who covered local government beforehand, people would lose their minds if like the Baltimore City Council or the Baltimore County Council was like voting with nobody watching, like trying to keep people out or not telling you when they're voting on something. So it's an appalling bunch of excuses that hopefully is rectified now.
And let's go back and touch on something that Pam said, because she said lobbyists won't go in. And the reason why that is because there is this, and I don't know how much of this is sort of Annapolis urban legend and how much of this is real, but there is this fear among advocates and lawmakers that if they go in and sit inside these rooms, these voting sessions, which are open to everybody else in the public, that their bills will be killed. Like they seem to operate under this understanding that something will happen to their bill. And so a lot of times I've had lawmakers, and I bet Pam's had this, I've had Pam's had this happen to her, where advocates will be outside the room and I will be inside the room live tweeting a debate on a bill that they're interested in. And when I walk out, they're like, thank you for live tweeting that, because I had no idea what was going on inside the room, and at least let me follow the conversation.
Ovetta, did you want to jump in? It looked like you were about to say something.
Oh, actually, I was going to mention sort of like moving forward in regards to transparency. You know, I think it'll be interesting as, you know, we get more intense into the debates on bills and they're taking up, once we get to the floor voting sessions where towards the end, where bills are taken to conference committee. You know, I'm not quite sure how they're going to handle conference committees. Conference committees are when a bill has moved in the House, another version has moved in the Senate, and there will be members from the House and members from the Senate who come together to reconcile the differences on a bill. Those meetings generally happen on, you know, sometimes on the lounge floors or in the I can't even think of the name of the room that they go to that's off of the two chambers. But
like the red room?
Yes, thank you. How did I forget the red room? But there's no ability to have, I mean, they won't even be able to do that. I'm not quite sure how that's going to happen now, because you would have to have it online. and there's no way of doing it online in the red room. So it'll be interesting to see how those types of meetings that generally happen off the floor are done. It was funny because early on in the session, one lawmaker who's head of a delegation had gotten up and said, "I'd like to meet with the members of my delegation in the Senate lounge. Is that permissible?" And the Senate president said, "Oh no, you're going to have to do that virtually." So there's definitely going to have to be some type of shift in how they handle these meetings that will come about later on in the session.
A key one on the conference committees is the budget. The budget always goes to conference, and it's a very big deal. The House negotiators and Senate negotiators come together to work out details of the budget, and it's always held in a room that is not outfitted with video cameras or anything. And again, they can't probably safely meet in person anyway, but our friend Len Lazaruk famously called it the mother of all back rooms. And that's what conference committees are. There is a lot of back room stuff, but we would be able to follow them and run around to wherever they're having these impromptu conference committee meetings. And yeah, I hadn't even thought about that, Ovetta. One more thing to stress about.
I know, budget conference committee is like my favorite time of year. But they did do, at the end of last session, they did do the budget, the extraordinary meeting with Senate Budget and Tax and House Appropriations together to come up with a consensus budget that just passed the floors. So I guess it would be something like that.
Yeah, I've gotten some indication that there's going to be a continuation of some of those practices from that we saw last session.
But the smaller conference committees are
Right.
serious. I mean, you know, was it 2 or 3 years ago, there was a bill that died on sine die. And there were a few that died on sine die that year because of conference committees meeting in the lobby. And it took a couple of weeks to unwind what really happened. And that was with in-person access. So.
Noting that it's almost 11:05, I want to open up for questions, and then when we finish our questions, I'm going to ask you knowing that things are shifting and changing in this session, what things you would like to see change in terms of better transparency for journalists and the public. But now I want to open it up to our guests. Any questions for our panelists? Oh, I didn't mean that for that to be like a rock in the pond.
I can ask a question.
Sure.
If you guys can hear me okay, I am wondering if you could talk about how the pandemic session has changed, like how you strategize, both in terms of what you're prioritizing, like in terms of attending bill hearings, because there's so many at the same time, and then also in terms of reaching lawmakers, how you're prioritizing and strategizing for those.
So Maddie, I don't know for me. I mean, this is my 19th full session, and I don't know for me that it's changed my strategy. I mean, every day for me, it is a look at what is coming up in a hearing and what I can reasonably get to and what's sort of the newsworthy, excuse me, the newsworthy bill. So, I mean, because in the end, like whether it's virtual, whether you're there in real time, being there in real life and having the hearings there, most of the hearings are at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, and so you can only be in so many rooms at a time. So that really hasn't changed the strategy. It's really finding the bill that's sort of the one that for me or for my my paper, my audience is going to be the most newsworthy, and then I will try to catch up on a couple of other things that are sort of important, but not as important as what I worked on. In terms of strategy for getting lawmakers, that's a hard one, because especially for someone like you, who is brand new this year, when I started, it was literally, I mean, I hate to use it, it's so cliche, but it's true. It was like drinking from a fire hose, and I felt that way for 9 weeks before I finally sort of felt like I got my sea legs under me. And I didn't have a lot of the cell phone numbers of lawmakers, and I didn't know who their staff was. For someone who's just starting out, I would try to collect as many cell phone numbers of as many lawmakers as I could. If you can figure out who their staff is, I would try to introduce myself to the staff, because sometimes getting to them, you don't always need to talk to Eric Lidkey to get a copy of something. If you can talk to one of his staffers who can get it for you. But I don't envy anybody starting out this year who's literally walking in the door fresh. I think it's a tough road.
That's definitely been a challenge, because I'm like a stranger reaching out, just like saying, "Hey, do you want to talk to me about stuff?" So that's been very difficult, but I think we're finally getting somewhere. But
I think one thing in terms of reaching lawmakers, like I'm struggling with like understanding the rhythms of like when they're in committee and when they're not, because I'm so used to, I did 4 full sessions before this year. This is my 5th full session, and part-time before that. So I'm like forgetting that like they're in committees. Like the budget came out, and then it was like in the afternoon, there's a budget and the inauguration on the same day. Then it's like afternoon. I'm like, okay, I need to call like lawmakers. And then it's like, oh shoot, they're in committee. Like I'm calling like, the chair, chair people and different lawmakers. And I'm like, oh shoot, they're in committee now. Like, and understanding what their schedules are. I think that like, it's going to turn out being like first thing in the morning, since they're not having these floor sessions, but they start committees sometimes at 11. So it's like, I need to nail down a lawmaker. I'm going to have to get them before 11, and figuring that out is the timing is tricky for me that I'm working on. Because again, you can't just grab them. You used to be able to like get them on their way into, or their way out of their floor sessions, or their way into committee. So especially being here, you don't see people coming and going like I'm in my bedroom. So I lose track sometimes of what the lawmakers are doing at this moment.
Karen Denny's follow-up in the chat kind of made me smile, because the idea of organizing your workday is, especially during session, is kind of amusing, because a lot of times the decisions are being made outside of you. The one thing I know for a fact is every day by 4:30 I have to file. And so that is the immutable law of journalism, is I must hit my deadline. And I know that, during a regular session, we're having 10 o'clock meetings and 1 o'clock hearings, and then other things happen. I mean, the universe conspires against you probably 70 of 90 days during session, and figures out a way to throw you a curve you weren't expecting, and something that you've got to go do that was not in your planner this morning when you walked into the State House. So I think you kind of plan around you plan around sort of the things that you have to do, with the understanding that all of that is likely to blow up at any given moment.
Danielle, did you want to add something?
Oh, well, I had a few tips, but it really depends on how your brain works. So, I love like spreadsheets and like things that I can sort. So if you haven't pinned legislation that you want to follow and get the reports from the General Assembly website, if you feel like that's something that would work for you, I highly recommend it. It works for me. I actually have like 5 or 6 different lists, like bills I must have to follow. And then ones based on my different beats. And then like, this is really quirky and fun, and I would like to do it. And then each day I kind of just go through and figure out what I can do. And then the other thing to remember about covering any bill during the legislative session is like, you have an opportunity to hit these things like 8 times. You have when they're introduced, you have the bill hearing, you have second reader, you have third reader, you have crossing over, you have that bill hearing, you have, the second, third over there, you have passage, you have signing by the governor, and you have when it's enacted, like when it becomes law. So, think about it that way too. If there's 5 or 6 things that you want to cover on a day, pick 1 or pick 2, and then figure out when you're going to cover the other 2 some other time during their process. And that kind of helps take the weight off of wanting to do it all a little bit. And then one thing I used to always tell reporters in the before times, when there was like a real rhythm to the day, at least, like it was a hectic rhythm, but there was like morning press conferences, morning floor session, afternoon press conferences, afternoon bill hearings, voting sessions, was to the best of your ability, like finish morning things in the morning. Like, the last thing you want to do is come back to your morning thing at 7 o'clock at night, because it's not fresh anymore. You loathe that you're still working. Like, it's just gone, you know, like, and your energy's gone. So to the extent that you can, like, if something happens in the morning, try to finish it up in the morning and then do a second thing. It just will help your sanity, I think.
I just want to piggyback on one thing Danielle said about there's multiple opportunities to write about a bill or an issue, as she said. And that's something I keep in mind when I'm getting requests for coverage. Like, I'm getting people calling me and emailing me, like advocacy groups in particular, like, write about this bill, write about this bill. A lot of times I say, I'm sorry, I can't write about it now, but let me know if it gets legs. If you think it's going to like move forward, if you think it's going to, you know, let me know if it comes out of committee. Like, and then it puts it on them to do work for me. But then it is true. If this idea that sounds interesting, but I don't have time now, if it becomes a thing that's going to move forward, I can write about it when it gets a committee vote, when it comes to the floor, or when it gets a hearing on the other side, that you don't have to do everything today.
Also, there are some I liked what Danielle said, that there are just some quirky bills out there that, you know, remember, you want to have some fun too. So you want to make sure that you do some bills that they may not even get legs, but they're interesting bills that you might want to write about. And I just suggest that you do that as well.
I wrote about one of those bills, Ovetta, a couple of years ago, and I broke one of my rules. I hate bills that have anything to do with state symbols and children. And children always end up being sort of the hardest, worst interviews. And I had a lobbyist who came up to me. She had a 10-year-old kid who pitched a story. He wanted to make a mineral, the state mineral of Maryland. And I thought, man, I would rather have this kid beat me to death with that mineral. And so but I agreed. I agreed. The lobbyist caught me at a weak moment. I agreed to talk to this kid. I went to the hearing first, and he was amazing. This 10-year-old kid literally like controlled the entire room. And at one point he finished up, he said, the chairperson said, you know, you really seem to know about this. And he said, I could talk all day about chromite. And I thought, I bet he could. And I ended up interviewing this kid, and he was delightful. And I ended up the bill got slaughtered. But it was a fun bill. He had done his research. He was a great interview. He was I got this adorable photo of him sitting next to this lobbyist who was working, an actual, like, you know, well-paid lobbyist who was working pro bono for this 10-year-old kid. And it ended up making a great quirky story that I probably would have never done otherwise. And I ended up walking out of the story going, you know, that was the most fun I had all week.
Well, good. It's nice to have a little bit of fun in there. I'm just, again, mindful of time. Thank you guys for coming out. As we wrap up, I just wanted to get your final thoughts from our panel on what do you think needs to change about the virtual session to enable better transparency and to help you in your role as public watchdog and stand-in for the citizens. And I'll start with Ovetta. You want to go first, and we'll go in the order that I introduced you.
Well, I think I'm just so concerned about towards the end of session, those impromptu meetings that happen. We talked about it earlier, but that's probably one of my biggest concerns as we move forward in session. Some of those important bills that, like sports betting, you know, marijuana, you know, LEOBR, those types of things are likely to go to conference committee, and those impromptu conference committees generally are, you know, hard for us to follow along in the moment. And so I'm curious as to how that's going to play out towards the end of the session.
Okay, thank you. Pam, what about you?
What was it exactly, the question again?
We were talking about what would you like to change about the virtual session to support transparency and your ability to do your job?
Yeah, I mean, definitely easier access to testimony, as we talked about written testimony. If it's submitted online, there's no reason why it can't be posted for the public. And again, as Ovetta said, we're going to need eyeballs on those conference committees not just for us, but for the public. And just overall, I was very stressed about this last session when everything shut down and there was no public and we were the only ones in there. Like I felt this like grave responsibility to be the eyes and the ears of the public. And that's still the case for in person. You know, we are still allowed to be in those chambers. Everybody else is, you know, by watching it on video, and video doesn't necessarily capture everything that's happening. So, you know, it's going to be important for us to like mitigate our risk, but still be there in person to see it, like, you know, be in the room where it happens, as they say.
Yeah. Bryan?
Ditto to all that. I mean, I won't take up anybody else's take up a lot of time. I think all of that is stuff that's on my checklist.
Mm-hmm. Sure. And then also, I think just adding into that is this pressure and worry about how journalists are going to be vaccinated. And that's a whole nother kettle of fish we don't have time to get into. But taking care of the health of our reporters is pretty paramount. So, Danielle, you want to finish us out with any final things that you would like to see in terms of transparency?
Well, I just, you know, I've been told that budget documents will go up as they're discussing them, which is a really tough process to follow. Usually they're only available if you're there in person or afterwards for other people. So if you're following along and, you know, there's a document that's being discussed or passed around that you don't have access to in real time, I would encourage every reporter, every member of the media to send those emails in real time. Like we were promised this transparency, deliver please. And I think that, you know, having one voice together on those sorts of things is important. And then just generally towards the end of session, I am worried that people are going to start getting vaccinated and some people will not be vaccinated and social distancing and other things are going to start breaking down. But so far that hasn't been the case, but I really hope it stays good.
Yeah. Well, thank you to everyone on our panel, and thanks to our participants for coming out today. I wanted to make one plug. The Press Association is sponsoring a discussion about equitable access to government records on February 2nd. That's Tuesday at 10. We're pushing, we're supporting a bill, House Bill 183, Senate Bill 244, I think, which is a Public Information Act reform bill that would increase the enforcement powers and oversight of the Public Information Act Compliance Board. We'll be hearing from advocates and the bill sponsors in sort of the hearing that we wish we could have if we weren't limited by witnesses and time. So definitely stay tuned for that. I'll send out more information. As I did say, we recorded this session, so it'll be available to all afterwards. And thank you once again for joining us. All right.
Thank you so much.
Have a good day, guys. Bye-bye.